How do you feed a million people? How do you keep them clean, entertained, and under control, without electricity, without internet, without modern engineering? Rome managed to solve that challenge, and for about 1500 years, no other city matched it. The next European city to reach a population close to 1 million was London, and that happened only around the year 1800. Yet what truly makes Rome extraordinary is that it was not only a city of shining temples and triumphal arches. Only a few streets away from the emperor's residence, people were throwing garbage from their windows onto whoever happened to pass below. Senators and slaves, marble and mud spectacle and filth all crowded together across the same 7 hills. Using modern AI reconstruction based on historical sources and archaeological evidence, we can recreate ancient Rome at the peak of its power, walking through its streets, entering buildings, and sensing what life there actually felt like, both its grandeur and its harsh reality. 70 million people spread across 3 continents belonged to a single empire, ruled from one city. At the center of everything stood the Roman Forum, the political heart of the greatest empire of the ancient world. Dozens of temples, monuments, and public structures filled this central plaza, yet a few places there witnessed moments that changed history. One of them was the Curia, the Senate House, where around 600 senators gathered to debate laws that governed much of the known world. Remarkably, the building still survives today, one of the best preserved structures of the Forum. In the open square stood the rostra, the speaker's platform. It was here that Mark Antony addressed the crowd after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Ancient writers say he lifted Caesar's blood-stained cloak before the people and read his will, revealing that Caesar had left money and public gardens to every citizen. The speech stirred the crowd so deeply that they burned Caesar's body on that very ground. Later, a temple dedicated to Julius Caesar was built there, making him the first Roman mortal officially declared divine. Yet the most sacred place in the Forum was not devoted to any emperor, but to a goddess, the Temple of Vesta, a small circular shrine where a sacred fire burned continuously for more than 1,000 years, guarded by the Vestal Virgins. Romans believed that if this flame ever went out, the empire itself would fall. These women dedicated 30 years of their lives to this duty, bound by a strict vow of celibacy. Breaking that vow meant death by being buried alive. Yet in return, they held privileges rare for women in that society: the right to own property, the authority to pardon condemned prisoners, and a level of honor respected even by senators. This tradition lasted until the year 394, when Christianity brought it to an end. The Senate House, the eternal flame, the public platform, and this was only a small part of what once filled the Forum. This single plaza functioned as the beating heart of Roman power. Rising above it stood the Palatine Hill, where the emperors lived, and gradually transformed the entire hill into an immense palace complex, growing larger with every generation. The Domus Augusti, the residence of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, began it all. By later imperial standards, it appeared almost modest, yet it established the model of imperial authority. Later, Emperor Domitian had little interest in restraint and built the Domus Flavia, a ceremonial palace on a scale meant to overwhelm anyone entering vast throne rooms, towering high banquet halls capable of hosting hundreds of guests. Foreign rulers and ambassadors who were received there left with no doubt where the center of the world stood. Next to it was the Domus Augustana, the emperor's private residence hidden from public view, with bedrooms, private baths, gardens, and quiet courtyards. 2 palaces side by side, one for ceremony, one for daily life. Nearby, there was even a private stadium about 160 meters long, created only for the imperial family and their closest circle. Even though the enormous Circus Maximus, with its hundreds of thousands of seats, stood visible below, apparently that was not enough. The emperor wanted his own arena. Yet, if you moved away from the marble palaces and imperial splendor, another city appeared, the crowded district known as the Subura. If Palatine Hill showed Rome at its most powerful, the Subura revealed it at its most raw, pressed between the Esquiline and Viminal hills. This district never slept. Narrow streets and crowded insulae. Rose several stories high, packed so tightly that sunlight barely reached the ground. The air carried the smell of open sewers, smoked street food animals, and unwashed bodies. Here lived the poor criminals and laborers who kept the city running. The poet Juvenal wrote that walking through the Subura at night felt almost like courting death. Even Julius Caesar once lived here as a young man, wealthy. Romans spoke of the district with contempt, yet the empire depended on the work of the people who filled these crowded streets. While emperors watched events from above, the real spectacle unfolded below in the Circus Maximus, the largest arena of the ancient world. On race days, more than 150,000 spectators gathered to watch chariot races, drivers speeding through dangerous turns, sometimes crashing into rivals. Romans called these disasters shipwrecks because the wrecks were so violent. Drivers tied the reins around their waists, meaning that if they fell, they were dragged across the track until the horses stopped or until they died. Yet successful charioteers could become extremely wealthy, and the crowds were fiercely loyal, dividing themselves into rival factions, blues, greens, reds, and whites. Riots were common, and the races became more than entertainment. They became identity. The circus held larger crowds, but the Colosseum remains the most famous arena. Nearly 2,000 years later, its walls still stand. With around 50,000 seats, it was smaller, yet far more brutal, because here death was the purpose. Over centuries, hundreds of thousands of people died in its arena. Gladiators, prisoners, criminals, and slaves. Animals from across the empire, lions, bears, and elephants were brought for slaughter in massive numbers. A typical day began with executions, continued with animal hunts, and ended with gladiatorial combat. Beneath the arena lay the hypogeum, a network of underground chambers where slaves operated wooden elevators, lifting cages and beasts through trapdoors, so that animals seemed to appear suddenly before the crowd. When Romans were not watching spectacles, they honored their gods through monumental temples. Most temples were devoted to a single deity, but the Pantheon was unique. Its name means all gods and emperor. Hadrian built it to honor every deity at once. Though many decorative details were lost, the structure itself remains extraordinary. The vast dome stretches more than 40 meters without internal supports, and at its center, the open oculus allows light and rain to enter, a striking achievement of Roman engineering. Nearly 19 centuries after it was built, a visitor can still enter the Pantheon and stand in the same space where Romans once stood. Very few structures from antiquity offer such continuity. Its design shaped many later domes, including the cathedral in Florence and the Capitol in Washington. The reason it survived is simple. In the early 7th century, it was converted into a Christian church, and that decision protected it from the destruction that erased most Roman temples. Yet, the Pantheon was not the most sacred place in Rome. That distinction belonged to the Temple of Jupiter. Optimus Maximus, rising above the Forum on the Capitoline Hill. Dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, it marked the religious center of Roman power. Victorious generals ended their triumphal processions, there offering sacrifice after returning from conquest. For centuries, the temple stood as a spiritual symbol of the empire, but repeated fires destroyed it, and almost nothing remains. Rome's religious authority stood Beside another foundation, military power and no force inside the city was more influential or more dangerous than the Praetorian Guard. Around 10,000 soldiers served as the emperor's personal protectors, receiving far higher pay than ordinary legionaries. While the main armies guarded distant borders, the Praetorians lived in Rome inside the Castra Praetoria. Emperors allowed armed troops within the city, despite older laws, because they needed protection. Yet, the same guards often became a threat. They assassinated several emperors, toppled dynasties, and even once sold the imperial throne to the highest bidder. Their ceremonial armor made them recognizable helmets with red crests, silver scale armor, decorated shields, and ornate swords. Though in daily patrols, they often wore ordinary clothing. While emperors managed the power of their guards, the daily survival of Rome depended on something quieter water. The city built 11 great aqueducts, and one of the most impressive was the Aqua Claudia, carrying mountain water nearly 70 kilometers into Rome across massive arches more than 20 meters high. Water flowed through channels by gravity alone, supplying hundreds of thousands of people each day. Portions of these structures still stand today. And when evening arrived, Rome did not fall silent. The city simply transformed. Fell, the city filled with the harsh noise. Fell the city filled with the harsh noise of wheels on stone as merchants and traders moved goods through the darkness. The sound echoed through the streets and made sleep difficult for anyone living near the main roads. The poet Juvenal even wrote that a person in Rome might die from lack of sleep before illness ever reached them. Without street lighting, the city became dangerous after sunset. Wealthy citizens traveled with slaves carrying torches, while others hurried through the darkness, hoping to avoid trouble. Thieves worked openly, and the vigils. The night watch, who served as patrol and fire brigade, could not be everywhere. The buildings themselves were another risk. Residents living on the upper floors of insulae had no sanitation and often threw waste from their windows into the street. Roman law forbade it, but enforcement was rare. Most of the city's population lived in these insula-tall apartment buildings of 5 or 6 floors, built cheaply from wood and brick. Entire families often shared a single room. Noise, heat, and the smell of neighbors filled the air. The higher the floor, the cheaper the rent, and the harsher the living conditions. Water rarely reached above the ground level, and kitchens were uncommon. Fires and collapses happened frequently, forcing emperors to impose limits on building height. Though accidents continued, every morning, crowds left these buildings and filled the streets. Many headed toward Trajan's Market, built into the slope of the Quirinal Hill. This complex with more than 150 shops functioned as the commercial center of the city, where spices, fish wine oilcloth, and pottery were sold, while contracts were arranged and supplies for the huge population were organized. Yet most Romans did not cook at home because open flames inside crowded buildings were too dangerous. Instead, the city relied on thermopolia street food counters, where hot meals like lentil stew, olives, bread sausages, and chickpeas were served from large clay jars. People paid a small coin and ate standing or carried the food away. Pompeii alone preserves hundreds of these counters, some still containing traces of the dishes once served. Those with a little more money visited taverns where they could sit, eat, and drink wine, often arguing loudly about chariot races. Meanwhile, the wealthy hosted long banquets called convivia, filled with many courses, entertainment, and conversation. But for the majority living in the insulae, Rome ran on street food. And after the market and the tavern, there was still one place nearly every Roman hoped to visit before the day ended: the public baths. The baths of Trajan covered more than 11 hectares and could receive thousands of visitors at once. In Rome, bathing was not a quick routine, but an important social institution. Visitors began with exercise, then moved through a series of heated rooms, sweating in the caldarium before plunging into cold water. The process could last for hours. During that time, people met neighbors, business partners, allies, and rivals. Agreements were discussed, and rumors about the emperor spread through the rooms. Entry cost only a small fraction of a coin, which made the baths accessible to everyone. Slaves, merchants, craftsmen, and senators shared the same water, all of it supplied by the aqueducts that carried mountain water many kilometers into the city. A resident living in a cramped insula without running water could spend an afternoon in comfort unknown in much of later Europe. When life in Rome ended, another rule applied. The dead could not remain inside the city walls. Because of this, the roads leaving Rome were lined with tombs, the Via Appia. Via Flaminia and other great roads were bordered by monuments and mausoleums. Wealthy families built large marble tombs so travelers would remember their names, while the poor were buried in communal underground chambers called columbaria, where cremation urns were placed in rows. For centuries, Romans cremated, their dead believing fire released the soul. Later burial became more common, influenced by Eastern religions, and eventually Christianity. Yet the dead always remained outside the city. Rome became the first civilization to manage life for a city of nearly 1 million people. Multi-story housing for most residents, aqueducts bringing vast quantities of fresh water, a commercial center with more than 150 shops, massive stadiums, public baths open to all, and street food counters feeding people who could not cook at home. Even the roads outside the city followed strict order for the dead. 2,000 years later, much of this structure still feels familiar. Apartment buildings resemble the old insula stadiums, echo the design of Roman arenas, and street food counters resemble ancient thermopolia. Materials and technology have improved, yet the same question remains. How can millions live together in one city? Rome answered it first, and modern cities continue to build on that answer